Some ideas are dangerous. Some books are dangerous. The book that I'm holding right now, Grave Error, written and edited by Tom Flanagan and Chris Champion, definitely falls into that category. Grave Error, How the Media Misled Us and the Truth About Residential Schools. It's been out for a few months now, and it's creating controversy. One mayor in British Columbia even facing censure by his own town council. Why is this such a dangerous book? That's the question that I want to put to Tom Flanagan. He is a longtime political activist, a longtime Canadian scholar at the University of Calgary. Welcome to the Full Comment podcast, Tom. It's good to speak to you. Tell me about this book, Grave Error, and why it's so dangerous.
Well, the book is a collection of essays relating, in the first instance, to the announcement that was made in Kamloops in 2021 about the discovery of human remains, unmarked graves, and so forth. The essays do go off a little more widely to deal with some related topics, but the bulk of it has to do with the issue of unmarked graves and missing children. And so what we do is challenge the conventional wisdom that there are a lot of missing children who went to Indian residential schools and never came back, and nobody knows what happened to them, but they're buried in unmarked graves near the Kamloops school and near other schools as well.
You don't say that there were no children that died at the residential schools. You're not saying that everything was hunky-dory in all the residential schools. You're challenging this facet that said, what are some of the things you talk about? Claims of babies being thrown in furnaces and incinerators, kids being hung, children as young as 6 digging graves. That's what you're challenging. Right.
Of course, children died. I mean, the schools operated for more than a century, and at a time when there were very few vaccines and before antibiotics had been discovered, and children died of tuberculosis and Spanish flu and other ailments. It's sad, but that was a fact of life at the time. So we don't challenge that. That's a fact of history. What we challenge is the more recent announcements about missing children and sinister deaths and the secret burials. And we find that there's no actual evidence for any of these things. The unmarked graves, so-called, have been located with ground-penetrating radar, which is a legitimate tool. It's widely used in archaeology and civil engineering and geology, so forth. And it tells you if there have been soil disturbances and other anomalies under the surface, but it doesn't tell you what's there. You have to dig to find out what it really is. So what they found at Kamloops was soil anomalies. They didn't find unmarked graves or human remains. And there's been absolutely no digging at all since then. And interestingly, the Kamloops leadership has retracted its original announcement about finding human remains. They put out a statement May 23rd of this year in which they used the term anomalies. So they walked back from their original position. But that hasn't gotten through to the media and to the politicians yet. Just this week, the Prime Minister talked about unmarked graves at Kamloops.
Well, I remember when the story first broke, there was an email that went out to all the editors across Post Media. And then it was sent to, by our respective editors, to all the writers. And it was a note from our Vancouver newsroom, because immediately the morning that announcement had been made, or the day the announcement was made, there were headlines about mass graves. And the note that we got from our Vancouver newsroom was a request from the chiefs at Kamloops saying, please don't call these mass graves. These are graves, and perhaps they're walking that back now, but they were saying this is not mass graves. And yet the media ran with it. And still many of my colleagues will use that terminology. Why was it so badly reported from the beginning?
Well, that's interesting. This is the first time I've heard about this note. the Chief Casimir at Kamloops mainly used the phrase unmarked graves, but she did go in July to the Assembly of First Nations, and she proposed a motion using the terminology mass graves.
Okay.
So at least at times, she used that term herself, but more often she spoke of unmarked graves. The big push for the term mass grave came from the New York Times, which had a story the next day. The bombshell announcement was on the 27th of May. 28th, the New York Times ran a big story, front page, I think. And they used the term mass grave. And of course, the New York Times is read all over the world and is probably the most respected newspaper in the world, or at least it used to be. And so, all over the world, people picked up this terminology of the mass grave. But the Kamloops leadership did sometimes use that term also.
The way that my colleagues covered this from the beginning has always left me with quite a bit of pause for concern. It seemed like, hey, we've got our own George Floyd moment here. Hey, we've got to jump on this. And the terminology would often go further than the Chiefs had. I remember that happening at Cowessus and in Saskatchewan. There seemed to be a zeal in the media. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We were originally going to entitle our book and use the phrase moral panic, but that's a bit academic, and our publisher came up with the phrase grave error, which I think is much better from the point of view of grabbing people's attention. But there was definitely a moral panic that took place, and people were reacting without stopping to think and asking questions and asking for evidence. I mean, even without evidence one way or another, this is not a plausible story. Kamloops Indian Residential School is right across the river from Kamloops. It's not out in the bush. How could 200 or more children have been buried there secretly? The school had many Native employees. Were they just going to stand by while Native children died and were buried? They had Native teachers. There were visitors there all the time. Plus the fact that the school has to, in those days, they had to submit quarterly reports listing all their children in order to get the subsidies from the government, which is the way that they're able to finance their operations. So they had no incentive to kill and secretly dispose of children. They would lose money by doing it, and they needed that money. And the government would ask questions if names suddenly disappeared. So anybody, with even a basic knowledge of history and geography should have asked some of these questions before running with the story. But nobody did. Nobody asked these questions. Even really good reporters didn't ask these questions. So that's the sign of a moral panic, when people lose their normal mental faculties and just start responding to signals. That's what happened.
The Truth and Reconciliation Report had a list of schools where there were graveyards. And that was published in late 2015, early 2016.
Yeah. Right.
And so people reacted as if there was brand new information that nobody had ever heard, that children had died and were buried at schools. Now, you do take issue with the way the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came up with their numbers and some of their accounting of this. So, but walk me through it then. Were there kids who died and were buried at a number of schools, and or was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission completely wrong in your view?
In their report and in their public statements, they conflated different issues. One is the issue of unmarked graves. Secondly is the issue of missing children. And they've never had an official list of missing children at all, but people like the chair of the commission, Senator, well, he's no longer a senator, but was for a while, Murray Sinclair. and other commissioners spoke of thousands or even tens of thousands of missing children without having a list of who these children were. Now, in fact, okay, and then there are children who died at the schools and nobody can remember where they're buried. See, what there was many forgotten children rather than missing children. With the passage of time, people, let's say, 75 or 100 years ago, somebody from your family went to school and died of Spanish flu or tuberculosis and was buried. Sometimes it was not possible to send the body back for burial in the home reserve. They tried to do that, but Canada's a big country, and particularly in the winter, sometimes you can't get through. So some children would be buried in the cemetery of the local church, which happened in Kamloops in a few cases. Now, with the passage of time, you go through generations, people forget, well, where was my aunt buried? Maybe the woman's parents knew at the time, but 2 generations later, the grandchildren don't know what happened to this relative. So you get these legends then of students going to school and just disappearing, and then irresponsible talk of thousands or tens of thousands of missing children. So there are many forgotten children, or forgotten grave sites is a better term. Maybe some children completely forgotten too. But that happens. It's happened in my own family. Children from long ago died and were buried and forgotten.
You mentioned something that I think is important to touch on here, and that is diseases like tuberculosis, influenza, Spanish flu. Much of the coverage, perhaps I should call it hysteria, around this issue has led with the idea that these kids didn't just die; they were murdered. They were murdered by the school system. They were murdered by the government. They were murdered by the church. The fact of the matter is, kids used to die a lot more than they did now, whether indigenous, white, whatever race or background. Kids died of childhood diseases, and we thankfully see less and less of that. But that's what was primarily happening in the schools, wasn't it? Was kids getting sick of what were then childhood diseases that would kill people.
Yeah, tuberculosis was the biggest killer. And we have to remember that there was no cure for tuberculosis until streptomycin appeared in medicine in 1946. And of course, it took time for streptomycin to be adopted and to do its work. So you get, that's the largest number of deaths. But just as many or even more children died of tuberculosis who never went to residential school, living on Indian reserves and attending day school. The fatalities were just as high. The kids came to the schools carrying tuberculosis bacilli with them on the, in their bodies. And some got very sick
or in some cases went home and spread the disease at home on the reserve.
Well, it could have gone back and forth, but the disease was out there anyway, apart from the residential schools. At residential schools, they all had, or well, I don't know about all, but most of them had infirmaries. And if somebody was really sick, they would send them to a hospital. So they perhaps had a better shot at recuperation in a residential school than they did elsewhere. But then there were other diseases as well. Smallpox by that time had been pretty well vanquished, so that's not a major factor. But you had flu and the terrible outbreak of the influenza flu around World War I. And then you had childhood diseases like measles, diphtheria, mumps, which can be serious. Now, all of us today are vaccinated against them, but that wasn't known and it wasn't possible at the time. So some children died of these things. And then, of course, there were accidents. Kids at school, active play, kids, falling out of trees that they were climbing. And, some of this happened as well. But there are death certificates for these children. They had a set of rules they had to follow at the schools. And the deaths had to be reported, and so the provincial departments of vital statistics have death certificates which show the cause of death. And it's not, strangled by missionary is not a cause of death. It's mostly mundane stuff like tubercular meningitis. Well, I say mundane in the sense it's a terrible killer, but it was a common thing at the time.
You've got one section that deals with the idea, and I'm just trying to pull up chapter 16 here, that it was improperly pasteurized milk, the tainted milk murder mystery.
Oh, yes.
So tell me about this idea being put forward, this, what would you call it, conspiracy theory? People making claims that it was milk that was killing the children.
Yeah. Apart the unmarked graves trope is very widespread, and you get that coming from literally dozens of communities. Beyond that, there are isolated stories about other atrocities, throwing babies in the furnace and things like that. The unpasteurized milk comes only from Blue Quills, which is a reserve in Alberta. I haven't heard this anywhere else. So I don't know how the people there got a hold of this. The reality is that I can't remember now. I'd have to go back and check the article, but pasteurization didn't become standardized for milk until, I think the 1930s. Anyway, whatever the date is. So, there were many, many years when kids were drinking unpasteurized milk in the schools, just as they were elsewhere in Canada. But the notion that this was done to deliberately poison children in the reserves is ludicrous. There's all kinds of documentation about how the reserves, they all had, many of them had nurses in residence. They all had doctors on call. There's all kinds of documentation about how these medical people went to great lengths to introduce new health practices when they became known. So the notion that they would hold back on pasteurization in order to kill as many kids as possible just has no credibility at all.
You do write about a man who has spread a lot of this over the years.
Is that Dr. Bryce? You mean Kevin Annett.
Oh, yes. Sorry, Kevin, not
Kevin.
Ken.
Kevin Annett or Annett, I'm not sure where he uses the accent.
So, this is a guy who used to be a United Church minister, has a bunch of websites and YouTube channels, and he has been posting these claims that you were just referencing of babies thrown in furnaces and kids digging graves in the middle of the night. He's been posting this stuff for years, going back well more than a decade.
Oh, yeah.
How does this guy get picked up and spread so that people are believing it?
Yeah, Kevin Annett is like a toxic carrier of these stories. It's not clear in many cases whether the stories originated with members of reserve communities and then Annett picked them up and spread them, or whether the stories originated with him and then they were spread by the Indians that he talked to. It goes back and forth. But he had a much bigger platform. It's one thing to have a few people on a reserve telling stories about how the priests were impregnating the girls in the dorms and they were bringing in an abortionist and then throwing the fetus into the furnace. It's one thing to have these local stories, but it's another thing when somebody has a national and, in fact, an international platform to retell these stories again. Annett, he found a few influential backers, people that were willing to endorse him. Noam Chomsky, for example. Professor Hall from the University of Lethbridge cites Annett, one of Annett's books in one of his own books, treats Annett as a legitimate source for something. So Annett didn't have a lot of support outside the world of the reserves, but he had enough to give him a sort of quasi-legitimacy. and then he would write books and produce videos that sort of seemed like they were scholarly, and he would organize phantom trials. He would invent bodies with legal sounding names and conduct trials of people for their treatment of the students. So he got expelled from the United Church in, I think it was 1997. They finally brought the hammer down. But he had started spreading these stories, even earlier in the 1990s. So, this goes back at least 3 decades of tireless propagandizing.
In the meantime, our federal government was looking to create an offense called residential school denialism. But we'll talk about that. That's where I want to go next. We have to take a quick break, Tom. But when we come back, let's talk about how far some in our society wanted to go to push this story, to push what ended up being false ideas. Back in a moment. I said off the top that Grave Error is a dangerous book that discusses a dangerous idea. It's gotten people in trouble. We'll explain that in a moment. But, Tom, the Trudeau government went so all in on this story. We had our flag at half-mast for 6 months, was it, on Parliament Hill? The Prime Minister, of course, went out, and there's the famous pictures of him kneeling with teddy bears in graveyards. But they also talked about, and I don't think they've gone ahead with it yet, but they've talked about the idea of making it a criminal offense to question what happened with residential schools and mass graves.
Yeah, that idea was floated and was endorsed by a couple of key ministers. Mark Miller, at the time Minister of Indigenous Affairs, and former Minister of Justice, I've forgotten his name. They were going to amend the criminal code to include residential school denialism along with Holocaust denial as a hate crime. Section 319 of the criminal code, I think it is. They apparently have dropped that idea, but they've come up with something that's probably even more pernicious. And that is Bill C-63, which has a big section.
That's the Online Harms Act.
Yeah, and a lot of it deals with things like child pornography. And that part is, well, I mean, I think you could debate the provisions, but it's the second part that is really problematic. The second part creates civil machinery, not criminal, but civil machinery, which, as I say, is quite sinister because it allows for anonymous complaints about something that is published now or in the past online. And then the complaint will be heard by a adjudicator is appointed by Human Rights Commission. The machinery is a bit unclear at the moment, but that's
this is the return of Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Code that so many of us fought to get rid of because it was being abused.
Yeah, that's one way of looking at it. So so this is an invitation to the worst kind of lawfare because anybody can launch a complaint anonymously at no charge. And after that point, the Canadian Human Rights Commission takes over carriage of the complaint and sets up adjudication machinery to hear it. And, I mean, who knows what might happen. But one thing is clear, that somebody who's the target of one of these complaints would have to spend, well, probably tens of thousands of dollars, maybe even more, to defend it. So it's a harassment, very costly to people that are targets of complaints, and lends itself to organization. I mean, it's not at all beyond the pale to think of some organization getting its members to flood the system with complaints against some target that they didn't like. And
I believe Mark Stein, this is going back, I think it was an article he published around 2006 in Maclean's, and I think in the end he was close to $100,000 of legal fees fighting the complaints against them.
It would be more today. Everything's more expensive now, sure. yeah, if you want to keep fighting it, most people would not have the money to do it. They would have to get help, and there might be organizations that are willing to step in and help. But it is an enormous obstacle to free and open discussion of controversial topics. It would be good for sales of the books. Now, I have to say, our book has been controversial once or twice in the press, and that has driven sales right up to the top of the Amazon book list in Canada. So I'm hoping for some more outrage somewhere. Let's drive the sales up again.
This dangerous book saw the mayor of Quesnel, BC, censured by his own council. They stripped him of his powers. This is a gentleman, Ron Paul. They removed him from committees and regional boards, took away his travel and lobbyist budget because his wife had shared your book.
Yes, this is really incredible. His wife read the book, liked the book, so she bought 10 copies to give to friends and people that she thought might be interested in it. And she gave it to a friend. The woman herself is not Métis, but her son is Métis because she married a Métis man, I guess. And her son got a hold of the book that was given to the mother, and then he started making an issue of it. And so local, there are 3 or 4 little, fairly small Indian bands that are quite close to the town of Quesnel. And so they flooded a council meeting and put a lot of intimidating pressure on councillors to vote. So the council voted, even the mayor actually voted to condemn the book, although they admitted that nobody had read it. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. This is why our sales went up to number 1, because it was so crazy. So they voted to condemn the book. The mayor himself had never done anything. It was his wife. But anyway, the condemnation of the book wasn't enough for these people. Then they flooded another council meeting and demanded that the mayor be censored. I'm not sure what they expected the mayor to do about what his wife had done.
Well, I guess he should have just kept a little lady in line.
Well, I guess that's it. Yeah.
I mean, isn't that the message that's sending?
Yeah, maybe a good smack across the jaw. I'm not sure what they expected.
These are progressives punishing a man for the actions of his wife.
Yeah, his wife is a well-known community member. I mean, these are senior people. I'm not sure exactly how old they are, but they're in their 60s or 70s. They've been around a long time. His wife has a business career unconnected to her husband's political position, but she has worked in political campaigns as well. So these are well-known people. You'd think his wife would be expected to have some independence.
Apparently not.
Apparently not. Yeah.
One of the threads running through the discussion that you and I are having, but also what I've been covering lately, is that we seem to be at a point where we don't like facts, especially when it comes to anything that touches on race, racialization, to use the term that I really don't like. It was covering the executive committee at Toronto City Hall recently, and they were debating removing the name Dundas from Yonge Dundas Square and replacing it with Sankofa. And at one point, one of the people speaking in defense of Henry Dundas pointed out that, well, Sankofa is a word from a language, the Twi language in Ghana, spoken by the Akan people, who were on the other side of the slave trade, as in they were selling their rivals, their neighbors, fellow black Africans to white Europeans. She mentioned that, and a counselor interrupted and said, "Point of privilege, Mayor. Point of privilege. I shouldn't have to hear this." And the mayor ruled in favor of the counselor.
Oh, my God.
Later on, they had a presenter from an academic from the University of Toronto, not to pick on academics, Tom, but you got some weird colleagues. Academic from the University of Toronto said that claiming that any African people were involved in the slave trade, which is a historical fact, is akin to residential school denialism.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
so we've got a political and an academic class, at least in part, that don't like facts getting in the way of a good narrative anymore.
Yeah. This is probably the most distressing part of the whole thing about residential schools, and it's the reason why I got involved. I mean, this is not my academic field of inquiry. I have written a fair amount about various policies towards Native people, both Métis and Indians, but I never wrote anything about residential schools previously. But I got so upset by the cavalier disregard of facts. So, just to repeat, there are no unmarked graves. All there are is soil anomalies. No body has ever been found. There are no missing children in the sense that there's no list of who these children might be. You could go down the list of false statements that are sort of cluster around this story. And as I said earlier, even the Kamloops chief has now retracted her statement about finding unmarked graves. It's surrounded with a lot of bafflegab about they still think that there are, blah, blah, blah. But she changed the language to say what we found was anomalies. But in spite of the retraction, the prime minister of the country still talks about unmarked graves. So people don't seem to care what the facts are. And as you say, it's even considered wrong to bring out the facts.
Well, I remember, was it 2009, Prime Minister Harper issued the apology?
2008, yeah. Mm-hmm.
2008. So I remember being there. It was a very, when you work in Centre Block and you cover Parliament Hill, there's a lot of mundane days. This was not one of them. There's a lot of pomp, circumstance, ceremony going on. And they brought in people from reserves and communities across the country. And I remember interviewing some people who had experienced horrific things at residential schools. And then I talked to others, and it wasn't just one. I remember talking to one chief who said, I had an excellent experience at a residential school, but I'm here to support those who didn't. And I think the apology is important. I wish I had the audio of that. Unfortunately, I was working in radio at the time, and the way radio works, it's gone. But you can't even say anymore that some people did not have a bad experience at residential schools. Residential schools is like a hair shirt that we have to wear now as a society. And we absolutely should be acknowledging the problems, the mistakes, the horrific experiences of some, but we should also be able to talk about the truth, shouldn't we?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And, the horrific experiences, I can't say that they didn't happen, but they are, for the most part, based on uncorroborated memories of elderly people who are telling you what happened 50 or 60 or 70 years ago. There is contemporary documentation of excesses in schools. You can find reports about dorm supervisors who were much too ready to resort to the strap. So, yeah, the schools had their imperfections, but I'm not sure that we have to remember that all of these stories about how much people suffered came out at the same time as there was a lot of money on the table. As part of the settlement for Indian residential schools, there was a process of compensation. 10,000 basic payment, $3,000 for each additional year. But the big money was for telling your story of physical or sexual abuse, and that could run up over $200,000. So there was an incentive there for people to remember and perhaps exaggerate the worst aspects of experience. And we'll probably never know what might be an objective account, since the staff of the schools, they were theoretically encouraged to participate, but in practice, the climate was so negative that most chose not to. So I've just been rereading a couple of books that were published in Kamloops on the Kamloops Indian Reservation about the school. These were published, one in 1986 and the other in 2000. So it was before all the big wave of condemnation of residential schools. And these books, the stories that the people who were interviewed there's a lot of negative stories, but they're, again, fairly mundane about, the food was bad, the food was tasteless, too much porridge. The supervisors were too quick with the strap. We couldn't speak our own language. There's nothing about digging graves or children dying. And there's some good reports about how they liked the sports program, the dance program. They went out and they beat the white kids in hockey and so on. They had international travel in some cases for their sports. So it's a mix. The books were clearly collected to criticize the school, so there's a negative kind of emphasis, which I think is part of the whole framework for compiling the book. But the evidence in there, as I say, it's fair. It's a lot of it is what people say about boarding schools all over the world. People talk about George Orwell's depiction of a boarding school, for example. So that's not to say that boarding schools were great. It's just try and get some sense of perspective here.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for your perspective, and anyone that wants to read the book, Tom's already said where you can buy it. Amazon.
Only Amazon.
I'm going to guess that there are some stores not carrying it.
No stores are carrying it, but that's not the fault of the stores. It's the business model. True North publishes through Amazon. Amazon does the selling. True North is a relatively small company that doesn't want to deal directly with retailers themselves.
It is having published a book that way, it's a far easier way for small outfits to
the sales are great. It is working very well, and but you don't have to worry about being shut out because they do print on demand, so it'll be there. But rush and get your copy.
All right, thank you, Tom.
Okay, Brian. Bye-bye.
The Full Comment is a post-media podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Prue with theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. You can subscribe to Full Comment on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, anywhere you get your podcast. Listen through your app or Alexa-enabled devices. Help us out by giving us a rating, leaving a review, and tell your friends about us. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.